In the summer of 2002, Michelle, an adventurer passionate about nature, decided to take on the challenge of her life: to hike the famous Appalachian Trail alone. Michelle was experienced and had completed dozens of trails in various parts of the world, but never one so long and challenging. With her logbook and a well-equipped backpack, she set out with the goal of completing the journey in a few months. At first, everything was perfect. Michelle enjoyed the serenity of the forests, the sound of the streams, and the fresh smell of the wet earth after the rain. She met other hikers along the way and always exchanged stories around improvised campfires. But as she entered a more isolated and remote section of the trail, something began to change, and Michelle started to feel like she was being watched. One night, she had already entered her tent when she heard footsteps in the distance. They weren't the steps of an animal, but of someone trying to move quietly. She left the tent with her flashlight, illuminating the trees around her, but found nothing except the silence of the forest. She tried to ignore the feeling, convincing herself that her mind was playing tricks on her. The next day, the sensation persisted. Michelle noticed strange marks on the trees, like cuts made with a knife or something sharp. They were symbols she didn't recognize, but they seemed too organized to be accidental. Despite the discomfort, Michelle decided to continue, determined to finish the trail. Everything changed on the morning of the 5th day. She had to step off the trail to find a discreet spot to relieve herself. She left her backpack near a tree and walked a few meters into the woods. When she returned, she noticed that the path looked different. The trees seemed to have moved. The landscape was distorted, and the way back had disappeared. Michelle began walking in circles, growing increasingly desperate. Suddenly, she found her backpack. A few seconds of relief turned into more anxiety as she realized something terrible. Her backpack was in a different place from where she had left it. As his night fell, Michelle decided to set up camp and try to reassess her situation in the morning. When she opened her tent, she found a piece of cloth inside. It hadn't been there before. It was an aged, stained scrap with a handwritten message: "You're in my territory now." Panic took over. Michelle spent the night wide awake, listening to footsteps and whispers coming from the forest. With each passing hour, the sounds grew closer. When the sun finally rose, she ran to try to find the trail, but with every step, she seemed to sink deeper into the forest. Trees that once seemed familiar now felt strange, and time itself seemed to warp. Days passed. Michelle survived on the supplies she had and water from streams, but hunger and exhaustion began to take a toll on her sanity. She saw human shadows in the distance, always at the edge of her vision, but when she ran toward them, no one was there. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets and mockeries in her ears. Time dragged on. Then, Michelle found something that froze her blood: a cabin in the middle of the woods. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries. Symbols were carved into the wood, identical to the ones she had seen on the trees. Despite her fear, she entered, hoping to find food or help. The interior of the cabin was covered in small bones, perhaps from animals, and the walls were adorned with symbols depicting figures. Michelle found a dusty journal, opened it, and began to read. It belonged to someone else who had gotten lost on the trail decades ago. The author described experiences similar to Michelle's: the feeling of being watched, the shadows, and the symbols. The last page read, "The forest won't let you go, and you become part of it." Horrified, Michelle fled the cabin, but as she stepped outside, she noticed something that nearly made her mind give way. The forest around her had changed. It was as if it had been rearranged while she was inside. The path she had taken to the cabin had vanished. Time passed, and Michelle lost track of days and nights. The hunger was unbearable, and her mind was on the verge of collapse. In a moment of desperation, she climbed a hill, hoping to find a broad view that could guide her. When she reached the top, she found something impossible: a human figure that looked exactly like her. The creature stood there, wearing the same clothes Michelle had worn on the first day of the trail. Its body, hair, and clothes were identical, almost identical, except the clothes were torn and bloodstained. But when Michelle tried to look into its eyes, she was met with a chilling surprise. The being that resembled her had no face. The figure pointed to the ground, and Michelle, still paralyzed with fear, watched as the creature vanished before her eyes. Where it had stood, there was another piece of cloth with a message: "We will never let you go. From the hilltop, Michelle managed to call for rescue. However, she says that to this day, she feels like something is watching her, waiting for the right moment to take her back. The cabin was never found. In 1995, a group of friends decided to embark on an excursion to the Appalachian Mountains. Led by Brian, an experienced mountaineering guide, the group consisted of 5 people. Sarah, a photographer passionate about natural landscapes, Lucas, a biology student, Emily, a cave exploration enthusiast, Jake, who saw the trip as an escape from his routine, and Raquel, a writer seeking inspiration for her next novel. The chosen trail was challenging but promised breathtaking views of mist-covered mountains and crystal-clear streams. However, Brian had planned something special for the group, a visit to a little-known cave off the traditional trails. He had discovered it years earlier but had never taken anyone there. It's a unique place, almost untouched by civilization, he told the group, sparking everyone's curiosity. After 2 days of hiking, the group reached the cave entrance. It was a wide opening in the face of a rocky cliff, covered by vines that seemed to hide its existence. The air around was colder, and a subtle metallic smell seemed to emanate from within. Sarah took a few photos of the entrance while the others, excited, put on their helmets with headlamps. "There's something you need to know," Brian said. "The locals tell a legend about this cave. They call it the Mouth of the Moon. They say ancient beings live inside it, with eyes that glow like silver. According to the story, no one who entered the cave after dark ever returned to tell what they saw." Jake laughed and said, "There's always a story, isn't there? Just to make things more exciting." "Exactly," Brian replied, smiling. "It's just a legend. We'll explore during the day and leave before sunset, okay?" They entered the cave, their headlamps illuminating the limestone walls. It was silent, except for the constant dripping of water echoing through the tunnels. The entrance was wide, but the path soon narrowed, forcing them to crouch in some places. Lucas was amazed by the rock formations and tried to identify the minerals glittering on the walls. After an hour of exploring, they reached a large and surprising chamber. The cave's ceiling was high, filled with stalactites that looked like hanging blades. In the center, there was a small lake, with water so clear it reflected the headlamps like mirrors. Emily ran to examine the formations while Sarah tried to capture the beauty of the place with her camera. It was then that Lucas noticed something strange. On the edges of the lake there were marks on the ground, like footprints, but they were too large and had 4 toes with claws that seemed to have scratched the stone. "This isn't normal," he said, calling Brian. "What could make footprints like this?" asked Emily, now cautious. "It could be some unknown animal," Lucas replied, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Suddenly Raquel, who was examining the other side of the chamber, screamed. They ran to her and found her standing, trembling, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond a narrow passage. "I saw something," she said. "It had glowing eyes in the darkness, staring right at me." Brian pointed his headlamp in the direction she indicated but saw nothing. "Maybe it was a reflection of the water," he suggested, trying to stay calm. Raquel shook her head but decided not to press the issue. As they continued, the discomfort grew. Strange sounds began to echo through the tunnels, light footsteps, as if something was following them, and a low murmur, almost imperceptible. Jake tried to lighten the mood, but his voice sounded forced. Lucas was visibly tense, and Emily kept looking over her shoulder. Suddenly, Sarah let out a scream. Her headlamp illuminated a nearby wall where something was carved into the stone. Humanoid figures with huge, glowing eyes. The images looked ancient but conveyed an unsettling feeling. This isn't indigenous art," Lucas said. "It's something different, much older." Then they heard a distinct sound, a heavy breathing coming from the darkness. The headlamp swung frantically, but what they saw froze everyone in place. A tall, thin, hairless figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing white as if blind. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it had never seen sunlight, and it seemed to blend with the darkness around it. "Run!" Brian shouted, pulling Raquel by the arm. They bolted back through the tunnel, but the creature wasn't alone. Others emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the dark like silver beacons. The sounds of their footsteps echoed closer and closer, as if they were toying with the group, prolonging their terror. When they finally reached the cave entrance, the sun was setting but still illuminated the opening. As they all rushed out, Brian looked back and saw what appeared to be a family of creatures jumping and grunting like animals at the cave's entrance. They didn't take a single step beyond the darkness. Realizing the sun was setting quickly, they all ran far from the cave entrance. Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Raquel never returned to the mountains. Lucas dedicated his life to studying subterranean biology, obsessed with understanding what he had seen. Brian, on the other hand, continued to guide hikes but never went near the cave entrance again. "Some things should be forgotten," he said, "and remain isolated. I prefer to keep my name anonymous for obvious reasons. About 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to study the fauna and flora of the northernmost region of the Appalachian Mountains, receiving a good sum for it. It was a unique opportunity, but if I had known what awaited me, I would never have accepted. This is my account and warning. It is not for the faint of heart." It all began in October, when the air in the mountains was already cold, and the vegetation took on shades of orange and red. My mission was to spend 3 weeks in a remote valley, cataloging rare species and documenting the behavior of nocturnal animals. I brought basic equipment with me, a field journal, a tent, and enough food for the period. My base was in a clearing next to a small stream. During the day, the forest was breathtaking, but at dusk, it took on an unsettling tone. There was something in the silence of the trees and the way the light disappeared quickly, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow everything. In the first week, everything went as expected. I recorded the behavior of various animals, birds, and even some wolves in the distance. But in the second week, things began to change. One night, while reviewing my notes, I heard something. Heavy footsteps coming from the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound, but I saw nothing. I thought it might be a bear and prepared to keep my distance. However, the footsteps weren't random. They seemed to be circling, as if something was walking around my tent, and every now and then they would stop abruptly, as if the thing was observing me. When I mustered the courage to go out and investigate, there were no footprints on the ground. The area was perfectly intact. The next night I heard the footsteps again, but this time accompanied by something else, a deep sound, almost like a groan. It didn't seem human or animal, but something in between. The sound seemed to echo as if the entire forest carried it. Once again I found nothing. On the third day I began to notice something even more disturbing. My camera traps installed in trees to capture images of wildlife had recorded strange figures. They weren't animals I could identify. The silhouettes were abnormally long, and their faces were obscured. But there was something glowing where their eyes should have been. At first I thought it was fine, since many animals have eyes that glow when captured by these cameras. I reviewed the photos countless times, trying to find a logical explanation, but I couldn't. I decided it was time to return to the city and report what was happening. However, the way back seemed different. Trails I knew by heart now stretched, in directions I didn't remember. Trees I had marked for orientation had disappeared or were in different places. It was as if the forest was playing with me. As I walked, I heard a strange sound coming from above. It sounded like crying, but it came from the treetops. When I looked up, my heart almost stopped. There was a figure hanging from a branch, skeletal and watching me. It moved quickly between the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Quickening, My pace, I realized I was being followed. I could hear the footsteps, now clearer and closer. And then I saw them. At least 3 figures emerged from the shadows. Their eyes glowed as if reflecting non-existent light, and their bodies moved, irregularly, almost like puppets. I ran and reached a ravine I had never seen before, even though I had mapped the area. It was impossible to cross. So I followed the edge, hoping to find a way around. The figures continued to follow me at a distance, always visible in the corner of my eye. The forest seemed alive, guiding me somewhere. Finally, I found a small cabin hidden among the trees. It was abandoned, but it was my only hope. I went inside and locked the door behind me. The interior was small, with handmade furniture made from the forest's wood. Looking through the windows, I saw the figures of various beings. They were there, motionless, surrounding the cabin. The sound of something scratching the door began, followed by whispers that seemed to come from inside my own head. I was already delirious. I screamed for them to leave me alone, but the whispers grew louder. The door began to shake, as if something was trying to get in. That's when I realized there was no way out. I don't know how long I spent in that cabin. I lost track of days and nights. The creatures never entered, but they also never left. Their eyes watched me constantly, glowing in the darkness. I no longer knew what was real or not. Hunger gnawed at me, and I even thought about eating the wood of the cabin itself. Until finally the door opened. I thought it was the end, but it wasn't. I was found by a search party weeks later. I couldn't explain what had happened. My body was intact, but my mind was never the same. Since then, I've had dreams of glowing eyes in the dark. My name is Deborah Shin, and what I'm about to tell you happened 8 years ago when my mountain rescue team was called for a mission in the Appalachian Mountains. I was never the type to believe in horror stories, but what we experienced in that forest made me question everything. It was the beginning of winter, and the temperature was already low. A young couple, Jake and Cameron, had gone missing while hiking in a remote area of the mountains. Their last message to their family mentioned something strange. "We found something very weird. We'll check it out and then come back." After that, silence. When our team arrived at the starting point of the search, everything seemed normal. Cold winds blew through the tall trees, and the fog made the atmosphere unsettling, but that was typical for the region. We followed the couple's trail for a few hours until we found their first marker, a water bottle lying beside the trail. We walked for another 3 hours, entering a more isolated part of the forest where the light barely pierced through the canopy. That's when one of our team members, Derek, stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing to something ahead. In the middle of the forest, without any explanation, there was a staircase. Yes, a staircase. It was made of stone, very old, covered in moss, and rose about 15 steps before ending in nothingness, with no structure around it. We stood there, unsure of what to think. "It must be part of an old house or cabin that collapsed," suggested Claire, another member of the group. But the strangeness of that structure made my skin crawl. The staircase seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to this world. Against my instincts, we decided to investigate. Derek was the first to approach. He climbed slowly, step by step, until he reached the top. "There's nothing here," he said, looking around. But when he came back down, he seemed different. He was pale, and his eyes had a lost expression, as if something had shaken him. "Derek, are you okay?" I asked. He just shook his head as if avoiding the subject. We continued the search, but something changed after that moment. The forest grew quieter. There were no birds singing, no sounds of small animals moving. It was as if everything around us had frozen. Later, we found the missing couple's tent in a small open clearing. It was torn, as if something or someone had attacked it. But what truly frightened us were the marks on the ground, footprints, many of them. But they didn't look human or like any animal. They were long, with thin toes, and spread all around the campsite. The next day, back at the command post, we loaded the photos from the couple's camera. What we saw made our blood run cold. The first photos were normal, selfies of the couple, landscapes, trees. But then the images began to change. There were photos of something watching them, silhouettes in the fog, tall, dark figures with glowing eyes. The last photo was of Cameron, looking directly into the camera with an expression of pure terror, as if something was right behind her. That night, while camped in the forest, we had our own experience. I woke up to the sound of something scratching my tent. I peeked through the opening and saw shadows moving between the trees. It was impossible to tell what they were, but we knew we weren't alone. Derek started acting strange. He muttered to himself, saying things like, "They're coming, they know we're here." We asked him what he meant, but he refused to answer. In the end, we were forced to call off the mission. When we reported everything to our superiors, they told us to drop it, as if they wanted to cover something up. We never found Cameron and Jake, but the staircase haunts my dreams to this day. I researched it after I got home and discovered we're not the only ones who've seen it. There are reports of similar staircases in other parts of the Appalachian Mountains and in forests around the world. They appear out of nowhere and seem to draw people in. They say if you climb to the top, something from the other side watches you, something that doesn't belong to our world. I don't know what really happened in that forest, but I know I'll never go back. And if you ever come across a staircase in the middle of nowhere, do yourself a favor, don't climb it.